Wow.
When you do interviews, what's like your game plan? Like, would do you have like a framework or like a game plan of how you usually prepare for your coding interviews?
Yeah, so it's a little interesting, but I've prepared in like two different points in my life. So I would say there's like interviewing when you're in college, and then there's interviewing when you're a professional. So I've done both. So it's very similar to the way you prepare, and it's kind of you kind of hear about it. There are books about it, and there are definitely a lot of blog posts, and kind of there's always like this unwritten just rumor mill of like how you do it. So basically, I would say the overall strategy when you're software engineering is you do a lot of leak code and hacker rank, which are basically like online problems, like brain twisters that involve a lot of like programming and just like you do these very like short, they're not like long projects, but they're more like these problems that are only supposed to take you an hour or so to do. So I would say like a lot of your interviewing is just doing a bunch of those and then reviewing books like Cracking the Coding Interview, which is basically like a condensed version of what you learn in maybe your first two like computer science courses.
Now, did you read How to Crack the Coding Interview?
Yeah, I skimmed it. I would say luckily a lot of that was still fresh on my mind because I was only like a year or so removed from college when I started looking for another job. But it was definitely, I would say I used it a lot more in college where there were some things that when I started interviewing for jobs, I was like a year or so removed from the classes. And I was like, at the time when I took those classes, I didn't know how important that information was going to be, like learning algorithms, learning all about data structures, runtime, big O notation. Like at the time, I didn't realize how important that was going to be later on. I didn't really know when I took those classes what interviewing was going to be like or what it was going to be like to look for a job. I thought it was going to be a lot more behavioral interviews or companies would be like, oh, is this person like a good fit? Like, do we want to have them for the summer? I wasn't, when I took those classes, I wasn't really that prepared for like, oh, like basically everything I'm learning in this class is going to be all the stuff I do for the interviews. So I definitely spent a lot more time when I was younger reading the book. And I think a lot of that information just kind of carried over to now where every now and then I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember how to solve this.
Isn't it crazy that what you do in the coding interviews has literally nothing to do with like the actual work you do?
Yeah, that's like one of my biggest complaints. I always feel bad, like at Goldman when I would do interviews or I would listen in, I would just like we'd look at this person's resume, they're stacked, and like we'd ask some feelers or we'll talk about something in the JavaScript world or something about a library we don't like, and then as soon as we get to like the, the like coding part of it, it's just so irrelevant that we lose a lot of good people. Or like I usually notice I'm like, oh, this person like they didn't read Cracking the Coding Interview or they haven't been doing these problems, so
It's cut.
they're not familiar with like how you approach it, how you talk about it, like how you communicate with us, like when you ask for help, what kind of help we can give you. Like that's always a big bummer because it isn't like it's nowhere near the type of collaboration or just environment or the type of things you actually do like on a like at your job on a day-to-day basis. So it's just so weird. And it's like if you don't prepare, if you don't practice, if you don't study up, you're gonna have a difficult time nailing those interviews or like making a good impression on like the rubric we have that we look at while we're interviewing you.
I know. And the thing about it is like I guess like the best way I would you say it's pretty much just like an IQ test you have to prepare like 2 or 3 months in advance?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's an IQ test. I would just it's more so like how well you study and how well you practice that you see a lot of different problems that you sort of start building like, oh, like if I see this problem, like I got to think, oh, it has to do with a map or it's a sorting problem. Oh, it's a problem that's asking me to do dynamic programming, so I have to like cache a lot of the searching I'm doing. You just kind of do a lot of the problems in those 2 to 3 months that you start to categorize problems as soon as you read it or as soon as like we ask you something that's maybe a follow-up, like you ask us a question, it's like what are we optimizing for or what are some of the edge cases, we'll tell you some of that and then you'll be like, oh yeah, this reminds me of this problem, and that sort of gives you a good like position of where to start. So like if you haven't been studying, like I can give you all these tips, I can give you all these follow-up like questions to like I can give you follow-up answers to your questions, but like if you haven't been studying, it's not going to be that helpful or beneficial to you.
In your opinion, what do you think is the hardest type of problems? Like dynamic programming, would you say?
For me, it's definitely graph or tree problems. I don't
Really?
know. Those can be, yeah, those, especially if they put them in word problems, those aren't always the most they're not always the most clear. Like you'll kind of read it and you'll be like, oh, like this is like I could do this using a for loop or something, or like I'll do some. So there's so many different ways they can word those problems that you'll start going in an entirely different direction, and then you'll realize at one point you're like, oh, like you'll start with nodes and you'll start like creating like arrows and stuff, and then you're like, oh wait, this is a graph problem. Like, oh, I just wasted so much time trying to figure that out.
Thought I
Those
had
problems would be the hardest. And just for me, I remember even in school I had problem with like grasping basic the basic like abstract subject of it.
But you usually really don't get those questions unless you're like interviewing unless like Amazon or like some like top tech companies, right? Like a bank would never ask you that, right? Usually.
I mean, no, they tend. I would say that definitely big tech companies like it's a lot harder to interview and like the questions are a lot more vigorous and they tend to test this. But sometimes it really depends on your interviewer. Like the way it works is we have like a list of questions that we're allowed to ask you, and maybe some people always stick with the top three, but you'll probably have maybe a senior engineer or like some very distinguished engineer who's like, oh, you know what, I haven't done a graph problem in a while, like it'd be kind of fun to see if this person knows what they're doing, and then like I'd also be able to brush up on it a little bit, because for some engineers it's like also like it's like an exercise for us as well. Like the interviews are supposed to be collaborative, or like that's the way they're supposed to be. And sometimes people don't take them that way. But a lot of times in interviews, like how well do you work? Like how well are you at like problem solving? How well are you of figuring out obscurities and just kind of clearing things up so we can find a solution? That is, it tends to. I think some of the better interviews tend to be where I'm feeding off their energy and they're feeding off mine. They're asking me questions. I'm either telling them, I'm either clearing up the problem they're having, or I'm like giving them like other alternatives to think about with my questions.
Is there ever a scenario, because you said it is an exercise, is there ever a scenario where the interviewer doesn't really know the answer to?
Um, yes, I would say that like a lot of times HR, the people in charge of the interviews, tell you to prepare, or, like pick some of these questions, like have them ready, and like look it over. But every now and then, like like a lot of us still have day jobs. Like I never know when like something could break and burn, and then I have to like maybe I normally do like half an hour before the interview. I look over the question, make sure I understand the answer, make sure I have some like follow-up questions already in mind. But like if I'm really busy that day and I can't do that half-hour preparation, I may come in a little more not as helpful, a little more like, oh, like what was the answer again, like, or like what is the answer to like the my follow-up questions. So I don't know, it varies, but they tend to recommend that you be like prepared for whatever when it comes to these interviews, and that it works a lot better if you know the answer going in, and what kind of solutions are accepted.
That'd be so awkward if you were the interviewer and didn't know what the answer was during an
Right.
interview. That'd be
Yeah.
tough. But I wanted to ask you, so I'm just curious, how would you say the experience as a software engineer as an intern differs from a full-time position?